There are not many here. I guess Ezra's here. Ken's here. A few were here at the inception. But everybody remembers in 1964 and 1965, there were these conferences about China. And it was there kind of that it was decided that that the National Committee on U.S. China Relations should be formed. So it was in 1966 that it actually, in May, in fact, exactly 45 years this month, that they made the decision to form the committee. And then on August 2nd, 1966, it was actually incorporated in the state of New York. So what I did is I kind of tried to take myself back to 1966 and kind of think about what were these guys thinking. So I couldn't quite remember. So I went to the New York Times and I got the August 2nd New York Times. And there were a few things that jumped out. One is there was a lot more news on the front page then than there is now. But it was also an extraordinary day. First of all, there was a big story about McGeorge Bundy, which I took very personally. He recently had become head of the Ford Foundation, and those of you who know me well know how absolutely appalled I was by the suggestion on the front page of the paper that satellite television be made a not-for-profit business. For those who don't know me, I spent 11 years in the cable television business. And if he had succeeded, I'm not sure if I would be here today. So another story was of Richard Speck, famous from Simon and Garfunkel's song, in fact, Silent Night, who pled not guilty to the murder of 8 student nurses in Chicago. That was the day a sniper in a tower at the University of Texas killed 13 people and wounded 13 others before he was killed by the police. The front page also announced the purge of the chief of the general staff of the PLA. My hero, Robert Kennedy, was in the front page, was defeated in his attempt to blend regular and reform factions of the Democratic Party on judicial nominations. And finally, and I guess most prophetically, there's a story which says U.S. infantrymen swept through a jungle area in Vietnam that had been torn up and charred in an attack by B-52 bombers, but found no enemy bodies. The story would be repeated many times. In China at that time, we should look at the other side of the Pacific, Mao had just launched the Cultural Revolution. 18 days earlier, Chairman Mao, then 73 years old, had swum 15 kilometers in 65 minutes in the Yangtze River. At least that's what Ezra Vogel taught me way back when. 6 days later, the Central Committee of the CCP would pass its decision concerning the Great Proletarian Revolution. And 14 days after that, 14 days after the National Committee was established, millions of Red Guards took to the streets in Beijing to worship the beloved chairman. Imagine, in that environment, creating an organization that was devoted to understanding China. Brilliant. They organized the National Committee around 4 basic principles, which really we've stuck with over these 45 years. Education, not advocacy. Representation of diverse views, but avoidance of left and right extremes. Members to represent all facets of American society, I think as we have here today. And an effort to be made to reach the general public, opinion makers, and government officials. In 1966, ping-pong diplomacy was in virtually no one's mind. Is Winston here yet?
Yes. Over here. Over there. Right.
You weren't think of it in 66, were you? Nope. And the China of today was absolutely unthinkable. But they incorporated the National Committee on that day, and our predecessors did an outstanding job of realizing the vision of these wise men and staying with the principles they set forth. Our roles in ping-pong diplomacy, Track 2 dialogues, congressional relations, education, hosting of hundreds and hundreds of delegations coming from or going to China have allowed the vision of those founders to prosper. The U.S. China Relations was essentially non-existent 45 years ago, and it has now become broad, deep, and complex. And it affects every person in both countries and throughout much of the world. Yet, despite the work of the National Committee over the last 45 years, and despite the work of the three people sitting with me and everyone, virtually everyone in this audience, the relationship remains plagued by mistrust on both sides. The military-to-military cooperation that was the backbone of the relationship when we cooperated against the Soviet Union is now wrought by mutual distrust. Almost 30 years after President Reagan committed to reducing arms sales to Taiwan, the issue remains a thorn in the relationship. A significant portion of the Chinese people believe that U.S. policy is designed to contain China. And too many Americans believe that China is a threat rather than an opportunity to America. If you need further proof of that, go on our website. You can see a C-SPAN call-in interview that I did last Saturday, where basically everybody said, I disagree with 95% of what you said. I couldn't figure out what 5% they agreed with.
Didn't take it personally.
I didn't take it personally. So before we get on to celebrating Jan, I'd like to use the opportunity of having three of Jan's former colleagues here with us to discuss the relationship and the committee's work over the last 45 years, with a focus on how we can reduce mistrust going forward. Let me start with Dick Solomon, who was famous for being Jan's professor centuries ago at the University of Michigan. His less memorable roles have been head of policy planning at the State Department, Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, and President of the U.S. Institute of Peace since 1993. Let me turn it over to you, Dave.
Thanks. And I know for all of us here, this is kind of old home week. We're going to have a crescendo when we come to Jan, but what I thought I'd do is provide the broader context in the U.S. in particular that surrounded the formation of the National Committee. And actually, I've got to begin with the summer of 1961 when Lucian Pye sent me down to Yale to start the study of Chinese, and who was in the class? But Doug Murray. And
You succeeded.
quite a few others. Jay Rockefeller was in that class. He had been recently in Japan and was thinking about, I guess, spending more time in Asia, although he subsequently went off in other directions. But the environment in which the National Committee was created reflected, frankly, a lot of fear and a lot of chaos and turmoil in this country. I mean, remember the 1960s, the assassinations of three major public figures, all of the turmoil surrounding the civil rights movement. There was enormous fear of China. Teddy White's television program, China, the Roots of Madness. And above all, there was the fear that drove the formation of the National Committee, was that we would get pulled into a war with China over Vietnam. And of course, there was, coming back from China, a tremendous political attack on U.S. imperialism. And so the environment was one of high tension. And the very month I started my teaching career, late August of 1966, Alex Eckstein, who was again one of the founders, told me that they had just created this committee that was going to try to contribute to what I guess today we would call the national conversation about China. And of course, you know, it was formed by a truly remarkable senior generation of American scholars: Doak Barnett, Lucian Pye, Bob Scalapino, Alex Eckstein, George Taylor, and others, it really was the cream, if you like, of the crop of people who really knew something about China. Many of them had grown up in China, dealing with this very, very tense environment. Senator Fulbright was holding hearings focused on the Vietnam issue, and again, senior people like Doak Barnett and others were called in to testify and to try to put into context the conflict in East Asia, the challenge of China, and again, people's fear that we would be pulled into a conflict with the Chinese. Alan Whiting showed up at Michigan about that time. China crosses the Yalu. Would China cross the Red River? Would we be drawn into another war? So very tense. The conception of the National Committee, as Steve has indicated, was contributing to our internal debate. There was no notion at that point we would get to a situation where we would have exchanges with China. The year after the committee was founded, a political figure then in public life wrote a very interesting article for Foreign Affairs magazine called Asia After Vietnam. That public figure, of course, was Richard Nixon, who, thinking ahead to what might be his second run at the presidency, undoubtedly, I've just been rereading his memoirs, he did not want to get burdened if he was so fortunate to become president with the enormous burden that Lyndon Johnson had carried, that is micromanaging the war in Vietnam. And one of the things we, over beers late at night, muse about, what would have happened if Hubert Humphrey had won the election in 1968? What position would Richard Nixon have taken on dealing with communist China? I suspect there would have been a lot of very different history, not only U.S. China relations, but think of it, Henry Kissinger would never have become Henry Kissinger. But then in 1969, there were the border clashes on the Sino-Soviet war in the Ussuri River, and it changed the political environment in a way that Richard Nixon's instinct that the growing divisions between the Soviet Union and China gave a political opening to leapfrog out of the Vietnam situation might in fact come to pass. And then October 1st, 1970, Chairman Mao brought Edgar Snow atop Tiananmen, gave an interview where he hinted pretty overtly that Richard Nixon would be welcome as president to visit China. And so 1971 was a year of great shocks, and it transformed the environment around the National Committee's work. The first shock, of course, was if you like, the Chinese side of ping pong diplomacy. April of '71, the American ping pong team was in Japan, and Zhou Enlai invited them to come to China, and it produced an enormous stirring up of interest and excitement and uncertainty about what was going on in China. And we were still American imperialism, but suddenly the Chinese seemed to be opening up, at least on the public side of things. And then, of course, there was July 15th, 1971, when Winston Lord came back from a secret trip to Beijing, accompanying, what was the guy's? Oh, Henry Kissinger. And of course, that was the second shock. It was a shoku to the Japanese, and it was clearly a major break in the relationship. Not to spin it out, but you all know what followed. Second Kissinger trip in October, and then the presidential trip in February '72, which followed on a reciprocal return trip of the Chinese ping pong team to the United States in the spring of '72. And I'll stop at this point only because that will segue after the following comments into one of the great joys of my professional life and personal life in ways I'll indicate it of getting to know Jan Barris.
turn it over to Doug Murray, who, as everybody knows, worked at the National Committee from 1970 to 75, and then was our president for a year before John Holden took over.
A year half-time.
It's only a half-time job. Go ahead.
Okay. Dick was absolutely right in mentioning the key roles played by these major scholars, Doak and Lucian, Bob Scalapino. But there's a category of folks that haven't been mentioned often enough, and that is leading figures in the Quaker community, Robert Gilmore and Cecil Thomas, who I would argue, while not the intellectual leaders of the organization's founding, were the motivators of it. And they had a passion for peace that led to Cecil Thomas becoming the executive director, the first paid executive director of the National Committee. Cecil has been gone for quite some years, but his son Steve Thomas, is a China scholar at the University of Colorado and had very much wanted to be here, but is elsewhere in the world and sends his, as you know, his regrets. That underlying motivation that Cecil Thomas brought, I think, stayed on in various forms, and one of them was my first boss in Hong Kong, Preston Scheuer, who was the Yale China representative, known to many of us, many of the nodding heads. Press had been a Yale China bachelor in China pre-war. He was a novelist, and as executive director, he expressed, I think, his underlying commitment in life, which was to try to help people understand China. That's what drove him. He was a quiet man, perhaps too quiet and too gentle to organize and lead the charge in the operation of a new organization. But like Cecil and Robert Gilmore, Press accounted for the energy of the committee at a key moment. When we talked about this panel today, I think Steve was hoping that we might offer some thoughts about what the committee could do next, suggestions for the committee, and the only thing I could come up with was just do a lot more of what you've been doing. For me, the key word for committee success is humanizing. I think that, especially, we'll get to you later, Miss, but the humanizing the relationship by causing people to do what Robert Burns had hoped. That would that God the gift to give us to see ourselves as others see us. And I think the exchange of peoples, the spending of time together in contexts that cut across almost all sectors of American and Chinese society is unique. With all of this explosion of activity between the two countries, there's no interest like self-interest. Every institution has reasons for promoting its own connections with China, and including universities. But the National Committee has played and should continue to play a key role in targeting communities, segments of society, where how they perceive each other and behave toward each other makes a significant difference to what happens politically, internationally, and so on. And so the notion of empathy, building a humanistic response, a non-suspicious response, a willingness to get inside the heads of your counterparts and not prejudge, I think is the success that the committee can take credit for above all. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. John Holden, who was my immediate predecessor and was president of the committee from 1998 to 2005, and is now a senior advisor at Hill & Knowlton, living in Beijing.
Thanks, Steve. It's great fun to be here, to see so many old friends. I wouldn't have missed this for anything, to be here with Jan to celebrate your 40th anniversary of the committee.
Perfect.
And to reflect a little bit upon the relationship as it's evolved over in my case, 40 years since I first began studying Chinese. I take up where Dick left off. I don't remember if I was aware of the ping pong players in April 1971. When I was registering for university classes that fall, I decided that I'd better, as long as I was going to college, I might as well graduate, and therefore I should take a language, which was a requirement. I went from Arabic to Bengali. I stopped at Chinese and said, this looks pretty interesting. An opportunity to study a civilization that had grown up very independently of our own, and a window for me into a different culture. And that was my perspective initially. 3 years later, I had the opportunity to visit China in 1974, only to find a country that was rejecting much of its own culture and perverting the narrative of its past. It was quite a shock, but an eye-opener, and it stimulated a great interest in contemporary China. I went on to university and studied classical Chinese, and we returned to China to make a living in 1980 to find that China had again changed dramatically. It had gone to begin its reform and opening stage, which one can speculate about. Would that have happened had the U.S. and China not had a rapprochement over the previous decade? Or if it had happened, when would it have happened? We don't know. I live in Beijing now, and today China is a country that has changed so much as to be really unrecognizable to those of us who visited 30 or 40 years ago. If we were to ask me what has changed most profoundly, I would say it's the people who now have a benefit from access to ideas and information, many of which were furnished through contacts with the National Committee in the early years, and who travel internationally and are educated abroad, and who now are seeing their country stride confidently onto the world stage. The conversations that we have with Chinese friends over dinner are as cosmopolitan as those we have with friends here in New York or in Paris. The National Committee has been a catalyst in the evolving chemistry between the U.S. and China, and maintains an essential role today as a trusted interlocutor and an honest broker. It's great to see the committee thriving under Steve and Carla's leadership, both of whom report to Jan, of course. And I'm very nervous, because Jan used to constantly correct me when I was giving speeches. She'd sit in the front and go, and eventually I just told her, just shout it out. I can't read your lips, but I'm expecting that to happen here at some point. During my stay here, 98 to 2005, it was an interesting pivotal moment in the history of U.S. China relations. We had, I think back to 1999 when Zhu Rongji came to Washington to seal a deal on WTO. We hosted a dinner for him that evening. I'll never forget, I went to the back door of the Willard to meet him as he came into the hotel. And I'd met him before. He looked like he'd aged 10 years. He was crestfallen. His cheeks were sallow and shrunk and shriveled. And I said, oh my God, what has happened? Well, I found out later on that he had been told by President Clinton that Clinton didn't have the political muscle to get the WTO deal through, and so he was crestfallen. He came into the reception room and saw many of the people here tonight. His face started to light up, and I now have on my wall in Beijing pictures of that reception where you can see him start to brighten up. And then I have my favorite picture of all is Barbara Conover hosting the dinner. He just had cracked a joke, and he's looking down at Zhu Rongji, who is laughing. Al Haig is just about falling out of his chair. The interpreter in the back is smiling, uncontrollably. And that was, for me, it's a real highlight in this relationship. But then we go from there to the embassy bombing, the Belgrade embassy bombing later that year, and a very, very tense period in U.S. China relations. Followed again a couple of years later by collisions of an American spy plane off the coast of Hainan. These incidences and this growing strategic mistrust that Steve referred to led us at the time to create some programs that I'm pleased to know still continue. And one of them is the Young Leaders Forum. I'll say something about that later on when we talk about Jan and her role. The Foreign Policy Colloquium. We brought in the Teachers Education Program. and lastly, the Public Intellectuals Program that began just as I was leaving. These are all programs designed to prepare for the future of the relationship and to educate people, create opportunities for them to build trust. There's never enough that you can do, but these were some of our efforts. Steve, you've asked us to think a little bit ahead, and I've thought about this relationship quite a bit, because we all think about it every day, and it's rare that you get a chance to sort of try to summarize the relationship in a few words, and I'll try to do that now. While there is good reason to worry about the weak level of strategic trust between the two countries, much of what happens on a daily level between Americans and Chinese is in fact mutually beneficial. It's negotiated, people are winning on this, and it's seen as such by the participants. Looking ahead, one of the things we can hope for and reasonably expect, I think, is that these interactions, economic, educational, scientific, cultural, social, will continue to be positive. Why wouldn't they be? There's so much to be gained. What about the potential for conflict between the status quo power and the rising power? There are many possible scenarios, and we should contemplate them all. Dr. Kissinger has just done this in a new book. But I remain optimistic that cooperation will remain compellingly superior to conflict, and that U.S. China relations will continue to be generally healthy and, again, perceived to be mutually beneficial. For that to be correct, that assessment to be correct, however, two things have to be true. One is that the United States needs to continue to solve its most critical challenges and regains its forward momentum and confidence. The second is, and I think you've guessed it, is that China successfully deals with the many contradictions, as Mao would have said, and strains that it faces, and fulfills its destiny as a confident and contributing global citizen.